The desert stretched out like an endless ocean of burning gold. Two suns hung in the sky, one larger and blazing, the other smaller and pale, but together they made the sand shimmer with heat. There was no tree, no river, no cloud, only dunes rising and falling as far as the eye could see. In the middle of this lonely land moved a small rover, its wheels crunching over dry earth. Rico sat inside the rover, his hands steady on the worn controls. He was a mechanic, not a soldier or a pilot, just a man who fixed broken things. That was all he had ever been good at. His dark hair was messy, and his clothes carried patches of oil and dust. He was not strong, not tall, not a leader, but he had sharp eyes and clever hands. Machines made sense to him in a way people often did not. For weeks he had been driving across the desert of Caris for, a planet known more for danger than for beauty. Wrecks of old ships often sank into the dunes when storms swept across the land, and scavengers came later to take parts. Some came with weapons and greed, but Rico came with tools. He searched for broken circuits, lost engines, or shattered hulls that still had life hidden inside them. When he found something useful, he fixed it, stored it, and sold it later. The rover rattled as it climbed a tall dune. Rico frowned and tapped the dashboard. The cooling system made a strange sound, a low hum that meant trouble. He muttered under his breath, pulled out a small spanner, and gave the panel a sharp twist. The hum faded. He leaned back and gave a small smile. Machines never stayed silent for long in the desert, but that was fine. Fixing them was what kept him alive. Hours passed. Heat waves danced on the horizon, making shapes that were not real. Sometimes Rico thought he saw towers or trees, but they vanished the moment he drew closer. The desert played tricks on the eyes. He stopped the rover when the suns began to sink, one glowing orange, the other pale yellow, painting the sky with strange colors. Evening in the desert was the only time it felt gentle, the air cooler, the wind softer. Rico parked near a broken satellite dish half buried in sand. It looked like an old relic from when colonists had once tried to build a base here. The project had failed years ago, leaving only scraps for people like him to find. He climbed out of the rover, stretched his arms, and breathed deeply. The air was dry and tasted like dust, but he was used to it. He set down a small blanket on the sand, placed a can of water beside him, and took out a scanner. The scanner beeped faintly as it read the ground below. There was metal under the dunes, maybe part of an old ship. Rico marked the spot in his notes. Tomorrow he would dig, but tonight he just wanted rest. He leaned against the satellite dish, looking at the stars that slowly began to shine as the sky darkened. For a while, he sat in silence, only the soft whir of the rover filling the air. Then he heard it. At first, it was so faint that he thought it was just the wind playing tricks again. A soft, high-pitched sound, almost like a whistle. But as he listened more closely, he realized it was not the wind. It was a cry. A real cry, thin and trembling, carried by the air. Rico stood quickly and turned his head. The sound came again, louder this time, from beyond the dune to the east. His brow furrowed. There should be nothing alive out there, no village, no camp, no person. Yet the sound was too clear to be an illusion. It was not human, but it carried pain, fear, and weakness. He hesitated. Every story about the desert warned travelers not to chase strange sounds. Many had vanished that way, lured into danger by something they did not understand. But Rico was not the type to ignore a cry for help. He picked up his tool belt, strapped it tight, and climbed into the rover again. The sound was growing sharper now, almost urgent, as if whoever or whatever was out there knew time was running out. The rover bounced over the dunes, sand spraying behind its wheels. Rico followed the cries, his heart beating faster. The night wind grew stronger, carrying the sound with it, guiding him toward a cluster of rocks. As he drew closer, he saw sand shifting strangely near the base of the rocks, as if something was buried underneath and struggling to get out. Rico parked and jumped down, boots sinking into soft sand. The cries pierced the air again, rising and falling. He moved closer and saw a narrow crack in the ground, half covered by sand. It looked like the entrance to a small cave, but it was blocked, as if a collapse had sealed it shut. He crouched, pressed his ear near the crack, and listened. The cries were coming from inside. Many voices, small and weak, together. His eyes widened. Something alive was trapped down there. He pulled a flashlight from his belt, shone it into the crack, and saw faint movement. Something was indeed alive, but the opening was too small to see clearly. Rico stood back, his heart heavy with the weight of decision. The desert was not kind. If he tried to dig, it would take hours, maybe the whole night, and there was no promise of success. But if he walked away, he would always hear those cries in his memory. He looked at his rover, then back at the buried cave. His choice was clear. The desert was cruel, but he was not. Rico wiped sweat from his forehead as he studied the crack in the ground. The cries echoed again, thin and sharp, like voices of children calling from deep under the sand. He placed his hand on the ground and felt a faint vibration, as if small claws were scratching below. The mechanic did not waste time. He hurried back to the rover, pulled out his toolkit, and returned with a small plasma cutter, a spanner, and a compact shovel. The desert was silent except for the weak cries. The two suns had already sunk low, and the stars now stretched across the sky. Soon the cold of night would spread, but right now the heat from the dunes still pressed against his skin. He began to dig, pushing sand aside with quick strokes. The ground was harder near the rocks, and his shovel scraped stone more than once. Every few minutes he stopped to listen, making sure the cries were still there. Each time he heard them, he felt a strange sense of urgency, like he was racing against a clock no one else could see. After half an hour, he had cleared enough sand to reveal part of a collapsed cave entrance. The rocks had sealed it tight, forming a barrier. Rico crouched and pressed his flashlight through a small opening he had made. For the first time, he saw shapes moving inside. He froze. The shapes were not human. Small bodies shifted weakly in the dim light. Their skin looked rough, almost like scales. Their heads seemed too large for their frail necks, and their wings were small and folded awkwardly against their sides. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the beam of the flashlight. Baby dragons. At least, that was the only word Rico's mind could give them. They did not look like the graceful, mighty beasts from stories. They were strange, ugly even, with uneven horns and tails that twitched nervously. Yet there was no mistaking their nature. They were young, helpless, and trapped. The cries grew louder when the light touched them, as if they could sense he was there. Their tiny claws scratched against the stone, their mouths opening in weak calls for help. Rico felt his chest tighten. These creatures were alien, and he had no idea if they were dangerous or rare. But one thing was clear, without help, they would not survive the night. He set the flashlight down, took out his plasma cutter, and began slicing at the larger rocks. Sparks jumped in the dark, and the smell of burning stone filled the air. It was slow work. He had to cut carefully so that the ceiling of the cave would not collapse on the creatures. His hands grew tired, but he refused to stop. The desert wind picked up, blowing sand into his face. He pulled a cloth mask over his mouth and nose, but his eyes still stung. He kept working, breaking the rocks into smaller pieces and dragging them aside. The cries from inside pushed him forward, keeping his strength alive. At last, one rock gave way, creating a wider gap. Through it, one of the babies squeezed halfway out, its scales brushing against his glove. It was shivering from heat and exhaustion. Rico quickly pulled it free and held it in his arms. Up close, the baby dragon looked even stranger. Its skin was pale gray with dark spots, its wings crumpled like wet paper. Its large eyes blinked slowly, full of fear and confusion. Yet it made no move to bite or scratch him. Instead, it pressed its head weakly against his chest, as if seeking comfort. Rico's throat tightened. "You poor thing," he whispered, though the creature could not understand his words. He carried it gently to the rover and placed it on a blanket in the shade of the vehicle. The baby curled up, breathing weakly, but its cries softened. Then more voices rose from the cave. The others were still trapped. Rico hurried back and continued digging. His arms burned from the effort, his back ached, and sweat rolled down his neck, but he did not care. One by one, he broke apart the rocks. Another baby was freed, then another. Each one looked different. Some had short tails, some had tiny horns, and one had wings longer than its body. But all of them were frail and close to collapse. Soon he had 4 of them resting near the rover. They huddled together, pressing against each other for warmth and safety. Their cries had grown softer, almost like whimpers. Rico sat beside them for a moment, breathing hard. He drank from his water can, then gently poured a few drops into the mouth of the first dragonling. It swallowed weakly, then blinked at him again with its strange glowing eyes. The mechanic leaned back and looked at the stars above. He had no idea where these creatures had come from or why they were buried here. Were they abandoned? Was this their nest, destroyed by some storm? Were their parents still alive somewhere in the desert? He had no answers. All he knew was that he could not leave them. The desert was dangerous, and without his help, they would not see another sunrise. Rico stood again, picked up his shovel, and returned to the blocked cave. There were still faint cries inside. More were waiting. And he was not the kind of man to stop halfway. Rico's arms trembled as he dragged away another chunk of stone from the collapsed cave. His hands were blistered, and sweat soaked his shirt, but the cries from within would not let him stop. He had already freed 4 of the small creatures, and they now lay close together near the rover, breathing softly. But more voices echoed from the darkness. More of them were trapped. The desert night pressed around him. The heat of the day was fading, but the air was still heavy, and every gust of wind carried grains of sand that bit against his skin. Above, the stars were sharp and cold, filling the sky with endless silver. In that vast silence, the cries of the baby dragons sounded even more desperate. Rico paused for a moment to check the creatures he had already freed. The first one, the pale gray dragonling with folded wings, tried to lift its head when he came near. Its glowing eyes followed him, as if it had already begun to trust the strange human who had pulled it from the sand. The others pressed closer to one another, shivering in the chill air. Rico placed a spare blanket over them, hoping it would help. He returned to the cave and studied the blocked entrance. The last section was worse than the others, with heavy rocks leaning against one another like a wall. One wrong move could bring the whole pile down. If that happened, not only would the creatures inside be crushed, but he could also be buried along with them. Still, he did not step back. He was a mechanic, not a miner, but he knew how to handle fragile structures. Machines often fell apart if one piece was removed carelessly, and this was no different. He pressed his hands against the stones, testing where the weight rested. Then he took his cutter and began to slice slowly, bit by bit. Hours passed. His muscles burned. His throat was dry. The rover's cooling system gave a sudden sputter behind him, and his heart jumped. He left the rocks for a moment, hurried to the rover, and checked the system. The desert's heat had clogged one of the filters with sand. Without repair, the machine would fail, and he would have no shelter or transport when the next day came. Rico sighed, pulled out his tools, and worked quickly. He cleared the filter, patched the damaged line, and tested the system. A faint hum returned, weak but steady. He closed the panel and wiped his forehead. The rover would survive for now, but only if he continued to care for it. Machines and lives were the same in this desert. Ignore them for even a little while, and they were lost. He went back to the cave. The cries were weaker now, like fading voices. Panic gripped him. He pushed harder, breaking away 2 large stones and dragging them aside. Dust filled his eyes, but he kept going. Finally, the gap widened enough for him to crawl inside. The air within the cave was hot and dry, like the inside of a furnace. He coughed and raised his flashlight. 5 more dragonlings lay there, half buried in sand and rubble. Their small bodies shook as they cried, but their voices were faint. They did not have long. Rico knelt and began lifting them one by one. The first was so light it felt like carrying a bundle of feathers. He brushed sand off its scales, then carried it outside and placed it with the others. He went back again, and again, until 4 more were freed. Only one remained, trapped under a slab of rock near the far wall. The creature's tail twitched weakly, and its eyes blinked at him in fear. Rico set down his tools and pushed at the slab. It refused to move. He tried again, using his shoulder, his arms straining, his legs braced. The rock shifted only slightly. He stopped, panting, his chest heaving. He looked at the little one pinned beneath. Its small mouth opened, letting out the weakest cry he had heard that night. "No," Rico muttered. His voice was quiet but firm. He would not leave this one. He returned to the rover, grabbed a metal lever from his salvage pile, and rushed back into the cave. He wedged the lever under the slab, pushed down with all his weight, and felt the stone lift just enough. Quickly, he reached under, grabbed the creature, and pulled it free. The slab dropped with a heavy thud that shook the ground, but the baby was safe. He staggered out of the cave, holding the small dragon close. Its breathing was shallow, but it was alive. He placed it gently with the others, who all shifted to press around it as if welcoming it back. Rico sat down in the sand, exhausted. His arms were scraped, his clothes were covered in dust, and his body felt like it might collapse at any moment. But when he looked at the small group of dragonlings huddled together, he felt a warmth inside that the desert could never burn away. They had trusted him. They had cried for help, and he had answered. He poured a little water into a cup and carefully tilted it near the mouth of the weakest one. It drank slowly, its glowing eyes fixed on him. The others followed, each taking small sips. As the night deepened, Rico sat beside them, watching. He knew danger was still all around. Predators roamed the desert, Storms could rise without warning, and his rover was still fragile. But none of that mattered now. The dragonlings were alive. And he would keep them that way. The night grew colder as the stars spread wider across the desert sky. Rico sat beside the baby dragons, his body aching from the long hours of work. The little creatures huddled close together under the blanket he had given them. Their cries had grown softer, replaced by faint squeaks and rustling as they shifted against one another. For a short while, there was peace. The desert was quiet, the air still. But then Rico noticed the wind had begun to change. At first it was only a light breeze brushing over the dunes. Then it grew stronger, carrying sand into the air. He looked toward the horizon and saw something that made his stomach tighten. Dark clouds were forming far in the distance. They rolled and twisted across the sky like massive waves. The desert was about to bring one of its deadliest storms. A sandstorm. Rico knew what that meant. Sandstorms on Carries 4 were not simple winds. They were walls of dust and rock that could bury whole camps and tear apart machines. His rover could not outrun one, not in its current fragile state. The storm would reach him before he could even start the engine. He stood quickly and checked the dragons. They were awake now, sensing the change in the air. Their glowing eyes darted nervously, and their tiny claws clutched the blanket. They gave soft cries, as if warning him of what was to come. Rico moved fast. He hurried to the rover and opened his storage compartment. Inside were broken panels, scraps of metal from old wrecks, and tools he had collected during his travels. He pulled them out one by one, throwing them onto the sand. If the storm was going to hit, he would need to build a shelter strong enough to protect both himself and the little ones. The wind grew harsher, whistling through the rocks, carrying streams of sand that bit into his skin. Rico pulled his mask tighter over his face and set to work. He drove metal rods into the ground and began fastening panels together, forming walls around the rover. His hands moved quickly, connecting each piece with bolts, wires, and whatever scraps he could find. Every few minutes he looked up at the horizon. The storm was closer now, a massive wall of swirling sand rising higher than the dunes. Lightning flickered inside it, bright veins tearing across the sky. The ground trembled faintly as the storm roared in the distance. The dragons cried louder, pressing against one another in fear. Rico hurried to them, lifted two in his arms, and placed them inside the half-built shelter. He returned for the others, carrying them carefully, his body moving faster than his tired muscles wanted. Soon all of them were inside, huddled together under the blanket. "Stay here," he whispered, though his voice was muffled by the mask. He did not know if they understood, but their eyes followed him as he rushed back to work. The storm was nearly upon him now. The wind howled, shaking the panels he had just placed. Sand whipped against his mask, filling the air so thickly that the stars above began to fade. He tightened the bolts, reinforced the walls, and dragged larger scraps to block the entrance. His fingers bled from scrapes, but he kept going. A sudden gust ripped one panel from its place and threw it across the sand. Rico cursed under his breath and grabbed another piece, forcing it into position. He used heavy rocks to weigh it down, hammering until it held. His body shook with exhaustion, but he refused to stop. The storm finally reached them. It struck with a roar so loud it drowned out everything else. The walls of sand slammed against his shelter, rattling the panels, bending the metal rods. Rico threw himself against one side, using his own body to keep it steady. Inside, the dragons squeaked in fear, their cries mixing with the thunder of the storm. Lightning cracked across the sky, bright flashes that lit the desert in ghostly white. The air was thick, choking, filled with dust and static. Rico's mask barely kept out the sand, and every breath was heavy. His eyes burned, but he held firm, bracing the shelter against the storm's fury. Hours seemed to pass, though it was only minutes. The storm howled without mercy, tearing at the metal, shaking the ground. Rico's arms ached, his legs trembled, but he stayed pressed against the wall, refusing to let it fall. Through the chaos, he glanced at the dragons. They were pressed close together, their small bodies trembling, but their glowing eyes never left him. It was as if they understood that he was the only barrier between them and the deadly storm. Rico closed his eyes for a moment, gathering strength. He had lived his whole life fixing machines, never fighting battles, never chasing glory. Yet here he was, holding together a shelter in the heart of a storm, protecting creatures that were not even his own. The thought gave him power. He braced harder, teeth clenched, heart pounding. The storm raged on, but slowly, very slowly, the sound began to fade. The roaring softened into heavy wind, and the lightning grew less frequent. The endless wall of dust thinned, its fury breaking apart. When the last gust passed, Rico collapsed against the sand, his body trembling. The shelter still stood, battered but whole. Inside, the dragons squeaked softly, alive and safe. Rico pulled himself up, pulled off his mask, and let out a long breath. His face was covered in dust, his throat dry, but his eyes shone with quiet triumph. The desert had tried to bury them. But he had not let it. The storm had passed, but the desert was still restless. The shelter groaned as the wind pushed at its sides, and the sand outside shifted in slow waves as if the land itself had not yet calmed. Rico sat on the ground, his back against one of the panels, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. His muscles ached from holding the shelter together, but he was still alive, and so were the small dragons. Inside the shelter, the little ones huddled close under the blanket. Their glowing eyes blinked in the faint light of Rico's lamp. They no longer cried, but their small bodies shook with fear. Rico placed a hand on the blanket, and the creatures pressed against it, as though his touch was the only thing that kept them steady. He wanted to rest, but his instincts warned him to stay alert. The desert after a storm was even more dangerous than before. The shifting sands uncovered things that were long buried, and strange predators often followed the chaos, drawn by the scent of weakness. Rico checked the rover again. It had survived, though barely. The panels were scratched, the joints loose, and one of the wheels was half buried in sand. He made quick repairs where he could, tightening bolts and clearing the filters once more. The machine hummed weakly, but it would keep working for now. As he finished, a sharp cry came from the dragons. Rico turned quickly, thinking the storm had returned. But the wind outside was calmer now. The cry had not come from fear of the weather. It was something else. He stepped outside the shelter and scanned the horizon. At first, he saw nothing but the swirling dust of the storm's fading edge. Then he noticed its shadows moving in the distance. Large shapes circled above the dunes, wings spread wide. His heart raced. These were not the baby dragons he had rescued. These were giants. Lightning flashed again in the far distance, just enough to reveal their forms. Massive wings cut across the sky, their bodies long and scaled, their eyes glowing like fire in the dark. They moved gracefully through the storm winds, their cries echoing across the desert like thunder. The babies squeaked louder, pressing together in fear and excitement. Rico realized what this meant. These were their parents, or at least dragons of their kind. The little ones had been calling all night, and now their cries had been answered. But there was danger too. Rico knew he stood in a fragile shelter, with creatures in his care that did not belong to him. The giant dragons might see him as a threat, a thief who had taken their young. If they attacked, he had no way to defend himself. He stayed where he was, standing tall despite the fear twisting in his chest. His hands were open at his sides, showing he carried no weapon. He glanced back at the babies, then forward again at the shadows drawing closer. The air grew heavy as the first of the great dragons landed on a dune nearby. Sand sprayed into the air under the weight of its claws. Its scales shone faintly in the moonlight, dark and rough like stone, while its wings stretched wide enough to cover a small ship. Another landed beside it, slightly smaller but no less powerful. Together they towered over the shelter, their eyes fixed on the scene below. The babies cried louder, struggling to crawl toward the sound of their parents. Rico knelt and held the blanket steady, making sure they did not run out into the open storm too quickly. The larger dragon lowered its head, its glowing eyes locked on Rico. The ground shook as it stepped closer, its breath hot and heavy, carrying the scent of ash. Rico's pulse hammered in his ears, but he did not move back. He simply placed a hand over his chest and stayed still. The dragon's head came closer until Rico could see the sharp edges of its scales and the fire deep in its throat. For a long moment, it simply stared at him. The babies squeaked again, crawling to the edge of the shelter. Then, slowly, the great dragon turned its gaze from Rico to the little ones. Its eyes softened, and a deep rumble filled the air, a sound that was not anger but recognition. The smaller giant moved forward as well, lowering its head to nuzzle the nearest baby. Rico exhaled, relief flooding through him. The babies chirped happily, pressing against their parents' jaws. The shelter that had felt so small and fragile now seemed like a safe harbor, filled with warmth instead of fear. But even in that moment of peace, Rico stayed alert. He knew the giants were watching him as much as they were reuniting with their young. If he made one wrong move, they might see him as an enemy. So he stayed still, his hands resting calmly at his sides, his eyes steady. The desert was silent except for the soft cries of reunion. The storm had left the land scarred, but in this small place of broken metal and sand, something far greater had survived. Rico felt a strange weight lift from his chest. He had not only saved the baby dragons. He had given them back to their kind. And now the giants would decide his fate. The desert was quiet now, only the soft hiss of settling sand filling the air. Rico sat on the edge of his shelter, exhausted, his arms heavy and scraped from hours of work. The baby dragons were huddled together, glowing faintly under the blanket. Their parents, massive dragons with scales that shimmered like molten metal, stood near the shelter, their wings folding carefully against their sides. Rico held his breath, watching every movement. He knew these giants could destroy him in an instant. One flap of a wing could knock him off his feet. One strike of a claw could shatter the metal shelter and crush everything inside. Yet he had no weapon and no plan except to remain calm. The first dragon lowered its head slowly, bringing its glowing eyes level with his. The heat from its breath brushed Rico's face, hot and sharp like a furnace. He did not flinch. Instead, he placed a hand over his chest and bowed slightly. He did not know if it would matter, but he could not show fear. The dragon sniffed the air around him. Its gaze shifted to the baby dragons, and then back to Rico. There was a long moment of silence, filled only by the soft crackle of sand shifting beneath their claws. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it lowered its massive head toward Rico once more. Rico felt a shiver run down his spine, but he did not move. He could feel the dragon's hot breath on his face, smell the scent of smoke and the desert air mixed together. It studied him, its glowing eyes searching, as if it could look into his very thoughts. The second dragon circled slowly above, then landed behind the first. Its gaze was sharp, assessing. The babies chirped softly, their small tails twitching in relief. They had recognized their parents, and now they were safe. But Rico could not let his guard down. Finally, the first dragon lowered its head to the ground and released a deep, resonant rumble. It was not a growl of anger, but a sound of recognition and understanding. Rico exhaled slowly. The danger was passing. The dragon was testing him, and he had passed. The baby dragons began to crawl toward their parents. They squeaked and chirped in delight, pressing against the massive legs of the giants. Rico watched as the first parent nudged a baby with its snout, lifting it gently with care. The second dragon followed, gathering the remaining babies close. Rico's heart swelled with relief. He had saved them. They were alive and now back with their kind. He felt a warmth inside that the desert's cold could not touch. One of the giant dragons turned its glowing eyes toward him again. Rico held his position, his hands at his sides. The dragon lowered its head slightly, almost bowing. Rico understood. The creature was not angry. It was giving him a sign of respect, acknowledging that he had protected what was precious to them. The babies chirped again, happy and safe, and their parents shifted to form a protective circle around them. Rico noticed something else. The dragons did not only watch the babies, they were studying him. Perhaps they wondered why a human, so small and fragile in comparison, had risked everything to save creatures that were not his own. The thought made Rico smile faintly. He had always known humans were different. Not stronger than machines or faster than other creatures, but willing to care when no one else would. That willingness could make a difference. That choice had saved lives tonight. The larger dragon nudged one of the babies toward Rico. It was a small gesture, but it was clear. The dragon was giving him thanks in a way the humans could understand. Rico knelt slowly and reached out. The baby dragon pressed against his hands, soft and warm despite its rough scales. "You're safe now," Rico whispered, even though he was not sure the dragonling understood. The glow in its eyes seemed to brighten, a quiet acknowledgement of his words. The desert remained quiet, the storm long gone. Only the sound of wings brushing against the air and sand shifting under the giant dragons filled the space. Rico looked around. The shelter he had built was battered but still standing. The rover was nearby, waiting, a small sign of human skill surviving amidst the giants of the desert. For a moment, Rico thought of leaving. The desert was dangerous, and he had no reason to stay. But then he looked at the dragons, parents and babies alike, and realized something. He had earned their trust. Perhaps, in some way, they had become his allies. The larger dragon released another rumble, lower this time, and stepped back slightly. Its eyes met Rico's once more, as if saying, "You have proven yourself. You belong here, at least in this moment." Rico nodded slowly, understanding perfectly. It was not a command. It was a test of character, and he had passed. The desert was no longer just a place of danger and loneliness. It had become a place of connection, of life surviving against odds. The baby dragons chirped happily, nudging against their parents. Rico knelt and watched them, feeling a quiet pride. He had acted when it mattered most. He had risked everything, and the result was clear: life had been saved, and the desert had been changed, if only slightly, by one human's courage. The night grew deeper, and the stars shone brighter. The storm's fury was gone, replaced by calm and the faint glow of the baby dragon's eyes. Rico felt tired beyond measure, but in his chest, there was a warmth that came from knowing he had done the right thing. The desert had tested him. The dragons had tested him. And he had passed both trials. The desert was quiet now, the wind soft and warm after the long night of storms. The stars above twinkled clearly, and the two suns had disappeared beyond the horizon. Rico stood beside his battered rover, looking at the dragons. The baby dragons chirped softly, huddled against their parents. They were alive, healthy, and safe. The giant dragons watched him carefully. Their glowing eyes scanned every movement he made, yet there was no anger in them. The first dragon, the one that had tested him, lowered its massive head closer to the ground. Rico took a cautious step forward, his hands open and steady. The dragon nudged a small crystal toward him, resting it gently on the sand. Rico blinked. The crystal was bright and warm, glowing with soft blue light. It seemed to hum faintly, like it contained energy from the desert itself. He picked it up carefully, feeling the vibration through his fingers. The giant dragon's eyes remained fixed on him. It was a gift. A sign of trust. Rico looked at the dragons, then at the baby dragons, now squeaking and crawling happily around their parents' feet. The desert had tested him in every way: storms, heat, exhaustion, and fear. Yet here he was, trusted by creatures far greater than himself. He understood that this was more than thanks. It was an honor few humans ever received. The dragons spread their wings slowly, a gentle warning to respect their space. The baby dragons chirped and fluttered their tiny wings, practicing what they would one day use to fly. Rico watched them with a smile. He had seen fear in their eyes earlier, but now they were full of life and curiosity. He returned the crystal carefully to his belt. It would be a reminder of this night, a symbol of what courage and care could achieve. The desert might be vast and unforgiving, but it had also shown him that life, no matter how small or strange, deserved protection. The giant dragons began to move, stretching their wings. One lifted a wing gently, creating a shadow over Rico. He felt the power beneath it, yet he did not flinch. The dragon nudged the baby dragons, guiding them toward a nearby dune. They ran and hopped, squeaking with delight, before taking small jumps into the air. The parents followed, guiding and teaching them. Rico felt a sense of wonder. He had never imagined a night like this. Machines could be repaired, engines rebuilt, but true trust was rare. And these creatures had given it to him. As the dragons took flight, lifting off the ground in graceful arcs, Rico waved. The giant dragons circled above once, their eyes meeting his. It was a silent farewell, yet it spoke volumes. They would remember him, just as he would remember them. The baby dragons followed their parents into the sky, their tiny wings struggling at first, then catching the currents. They chirped happily, making small loops and dives under the careful watch of their parents. The desert felt alive again, filled with motion and energy. Rico turned back to the rover. It was battered but still functional. He climbed in, checking the engine, the wheels, and the tools he had used to survive the night. Everything was ready. The desert lay ahead, endless and dangerous, yet also full of possibility. He started the rover and drove slowly across the sand, feeling the glow of the crystal in his belt. It hummed softly with energy, and he could almost feel the connection between him and the dragons. Perhaps it was a gift that would guide him, protect him, or simply remind him that courage and kindness could create bonds beyond understanding. Rico thought of the storm, the heavy rocks, and the trapped baby dragons. Every choice he had made had mattered. Every moment of fear and exhaustion had been worth it. The desert had challenged him, but he had proven himself not just to the dragons, but to himself. As he drove toward the horizon, he looked back once. The dunes were still, but in his mind, he could see the dragons circling above. He could hear the soft chirps of the baby dragons, full of life and trust. For the first time in many days, he smiled fully. The desert was no longer just a place of heat, dust, and danger. It was a place where life survived, where trust was earned, and where a human could make a difference in the galaxy. Rico knew he would carry this memory with him forever. The crystal in his belt, the trust of the dragons, and the night he chose to act when no one else would. He would continue to travel, to fix what was broken, to face danger when it mattered. But now, he knew that courage was more than strength. It was care. It was action when it was hardest. It was choosing to help even when everything around you seemed impossible. The sun would rise soon over the dunes, bringing a new day and new challenges. Rico drove forward into the soft light, his heart full, his mind calm. The desert stretched before him, vast and endless, but no longer lonely. He had been tested, and he had passed. The dragons had trusted him. The baby dragons had survived. And Rico knew one simple truth that would guide him forever, even in the hardest deserts, in the hottest storms, kindness and courage could light the way. And with that, the human mechanic drove on, carrying the memory of a night when the desert, the dragons, and the stars had all come together to teach him the true meaning of trust.